Welcome to Cal-Am's Lifestyle University. Hi, I'm Jessica with Clink Wine Education and Entertainment, and I'll be your host for today's virtual mixology class. Amidst fall, I figured why not stay on subject, so today's class is going to cover hard apple cider and cider cocktails. Just perfect for your stay-at-home fall or time with family. So to get started, let's go ahead and cover just a couple of terms and definitions for a little clarity. And then we'll talk a little bit about the history of cider making and hard cider through Europe and America, and get a little bit of science in there as well. And then we'll dive right into making a few cocktails with hard apple cider and how to incorporate cider into your cocktail repertoire at home. So without much ado, a few terms starting off. We have the term cider itself can be used and is widely used, especially in Europe, specifically to refer to a fermented form of apple juice or apple cider. Now that said, traditionally in America, we often will use the term apple cider and apple juice almost interchangeably. However, apple cider is really going to specifically refer to the fresh pressed juice of apples that has been unfiltered, unpasteurized, and really unadulterated. You're not going to get some of the additional preservatives or additional sweeteners that you will sometimes see in traditional apple juices sold in the United States. Now again, getting back to the subject of fermented, aka hard apple cider. This is a tradition that has a long history in Europe especially. Of course, we have the fresh pressed apple cider, again, unfiltered, unpasteurized. That's going to really retain a lot of the flavor, the texture, and in the terms of fermenting and creating a hard cider, a lot of that tannin and texture is really what we're looking for in producing a high quality cider. Now, getting into a little bit of the history. Really, cider, it dates back about as far as beer and wine. Of course, the history of which came first is always in contention, because the reality is the production and consumption of some of these early alcoholic beverages and the ancient variations was mostly accidental, and also just a simple way of helping preserve not only the agricultural crops that were being grown at the time, but also to help with the difficulty of getting safe water. So you have this ancient history of cider. I think the earliest written record, according to Washington State University, definitely an apple region, dates back to 55 BCE with Julius Caesar. So you have this early Roman cider drinking tradition. Really, though, you see a lot of development happening in the cooler climates, such as England, other parts of the UK, and northern Spain. My cat happens to like cider as well, but we'll politely ask her to leave. So getting back to the early development of cider in England, really began with the Norman invasion of England in about 1066, when you saw the import of French traditional apple cider orchards starting to be developed in England and Ireland as well. So you had a strong cider production that started in early France, clearly as well, in some of those cooler climates, as well as northern Spain, where cider is traditionally known as Cider. I just think it's a beautiful pronunciation. And after some of those early developments, especially in cool climates within Europe, you saw, of course, the importation of apples starting to be brought into colonial America very early on in that exploration of the New World. Really, apple cider had already become a prominent English commodity used for paying taxes and tariffs. It was only just barely behind ale and beer consumption, realistically, and even today England remains not only the largest consumer of apple cider in the world, but also is home to some of the largest cider making producers. So definitely keep that on your radar if you're looking at exploring the world of ciders and hard ciders. So let's get back to the early American colonies. Really, it was just a few years after American colonists first landed in Plymouth, 1620. A few years later, you saw apple orchards being planted in the Massachusetts Bay colonies. Now, it took a few years for this development, not only because, of course, colonists were just getting used to the climate and terrain of these new areas, but honeybees actually were not native to North America as well. So aside from the apples being brought over as saplings on some of those early exploration boats, you really had to see the development of importing honeybees into America in order for apple orchards to take off. But once they did, they were amazing to the mainstay of those early colonists. Again, because apples are very hardy, they tend to lend themselves towards many different preservation methods. Of course, cider, and especially hard cider, not being least of those. But you really saw a lot of struggle around the establishment of grape vineyards and a lot of some of the early grains throughout some of the cooler climate on that East Coast in America. So apples really became the mainstay at the table, both in terms of regular cider and, of course, hard cider. Again, even drank by children in a diluted form because it was a much safer way of drinking water at the time. That said, come to the about 1800s, and cider was the number one staple of colonial America, drinking and consumption, mainstay at every household table. But then it started to get it was waning in popularity because of a few different factors. First and foremost, the Industrial Revolution really saw a lot of families and specifically workers moving into cities out of the rural farm towns. And so you didn't have the same kind of access to apple orchards, and apple cider, especially in its unfiltered, unpasteurized version, doesn't have quite the same shelf life. So you saw a decrease in cider consumption while you saw an increase in the consumption of new products being produced, such as beers and ales in the United States, as well as some of those early whiskeys and gin. But really this decline only lasted a short period until the temperance movement really moved in and created really that last straw that broke the camel's back in terms of cider popularity in America. And unfortunately, until very recently, we haven't heard a lot about hard cider or cider in America specifically for several decades. Since Prohibition. Again, because of the growing popularity of whiskey, wine production in America, beer production, and other unique liqueurs and alcoholic imports from Europe after Prohibition ended. However, the tradition of cider making clearly has gone up strong in Europe as well as the UK. And I think there is one other side note to make as far as that production is concerned. And you see a lot of old houses of cider production in Europe still producing from heritage apples that do tend to have a little higher acid and a little bit more of that tannin and texture that we were talking about. So these apple ciders tend to have a very complex nature. They're not necessarily as sweet as we would think of a traditional non-fermented apple cider, or even some of the apple ciders made in America, simply because we have a lot of sun. And we have a ton of different varieties that we're producing apple cider with here in the United States. Not all are exactly the same, but that doesn't make them not equal and just as equally interesting to explore. So I highly recommend that. Last on that note, years past Prohibition and now with the craft beer movement and craft spirit movement really reinvigorating not only the cultivation of some of these old apple heritage styles and rehabilitating a lot of the old orchards on the East Coast and even further west. You see a huge resurgence in the craft cider production, not only in Europe, but also in America, and of course, a wide diversity of styles to explore. So definitely have fun with that, and we'll talk about a few different options to explore in just a moment. But let's go ahead and get to some cocktail making. So for our cocktails today, we're going to use both a traditional unfermented apple cider, which I will make a note also. You'll notice with that unfiltered, unrefined variation, you do get quite an opaque, kind of viscous style apple juice, but this is great for doing, in this case, a mulled cider, because again, you're going to add a lot more flavor and a little bit more of that texture along with all of the spice that we've incorporated. So for any mulled cider, and this is a great cocktail option for groups and also for those who might not want to be imbibing some alcohol, because the base of this is simply that apple cider, nice, fresh, unfiltered, and then we're going to add some spices to it and just bring it to a simmer for a little bit. In this case, I recommend, and of course the recipes will be included as well, but about a quart of apple juice. I put in 1 beautiful cinnamon stick, and I highly recommend using whole spices for mulled cider. Anything that's already ground up, you're going to want to use a very, very small amount of, and you won't be able to filter it out, so it will add a different texture, and it will continue to spice the cider as it sits in your fridge or a coffee thermos or otherwise. So just be aware of that. It will increase the spice content as well as some of that tannin and bitterness that comes from hard spices like this. But in this case, about a quart of apple cider, half an orange sliced up just like this, thrown right in the pot, cinnamon stick. I put in about a dozen cloves. You can start with less, maybe even 6, and then I did add a couple of allspice berries. However, you're going to just stick with those general warm fall spices that you prefer. You can add some vanilla bean, you can add some star anise pods as well, but again, sticking with as much of the whole spice as possible. In this case, I also like it a little bit tart, and I'm a huge cranberry fan. So I actually added about a dozen cranberries to the pot and let them burst. And then in this case, you can see there isn't a lot of residue. So once I've brought everything up to a boil, let it simmer covered for about 5 minutes or so. You want to keep all of that liquid and goodness inside the pot. And then I fully strain the liquid and go ahead and put it either in a coffee thermos. If you're keeping it hot for an event, you can use a small crock pot if that works better for you, or go ahead and bottle it and use it at a later date. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and add just a little bit of spike to our mulled apple cider. For my personal preference, I prefer using brandy in my toddies and a lot of my hot beverages. However, a bourbon, a spiced rum, or if you're a huge tequila fan, even an añejo would work beautifully with this exact same cocktail. So feel free to make your base mulled cider and have it available for your non-alcoholic drinkers, and perhaps a different variation of spirits to have on hand for them to add themselves. So in this case, we'll go ahead and add a little bit of brandy. I already put a little orange slice on there I like for garnish. We'll add a couple of cranberries just for fun. They're kind of nice, again, if you like that tartness to bite into while you're drinking the sweet spiced cider. And I'll go ahead and leave this little cinnamon stick just for the beauty of it. We'll set that one aside. So definitely the most classic cocktail or non-alcoholic version of producing cider during the fall and winter holiday season and otherwise. Moving on, I wanted to also talk a little bit more about some of the fun dry style craft ciders, hard craft ciders being produced in America. So this is from Schilling. As I mentioned, Washington is a huge apple state, as you probably know. And Schilling is exactly that same name that you may remember from your spice cabinet way back before it was McCormick. So huge history in agriculture, spice cultivation within the family. And this is the grandson or great-grandson, I believe, of the founder of Schilling, who's now been cultivating apple orchards throughout Washington and producing a wide range of just really accessible, craft, gluten-free, all-natural ciders. So I love the London Dry. Is going to be one of their driest styles, and when you are creating cocktails, definitely the key component in incorporating cider into your cocktail is going to be taking into account the amount of sugar in the hard cider that you're using. So if you are using something that's flavored or a little on the sweeter side, something like Ace cider tends to have a little additional sweetener added into it, you definitely want to make sure that you're taking that into account when you're balancing out your cocktail or incorporating it in maybe a smaller amount. In this case, we have a lovely, very dry, crisp style cider. And I had made a little of my own cocktail variation for us today. They also happen to make a beautiful chai spiced cider that is a little bit on the sweeter side. So I took that as my inspiration, and instead, in preparation for next month's mixology class, I went ahead and made my own kind of fall chai spiced bourbon. In this case, I truly just took about a pint of bourbon and let it sit for 48 hours with a chai tea bag. No additional sugar, just a vanilla bean, and again, 1 cinnamon stick to kind of bump up that spice level. I do have the shot here. So we'll go ahead, and in this case, truly, we already have all of our flavor and our spice and our spirit, about an ounce, ounce and a half. Again, a lot of these drinks vary the amount of alcohol based on your preference, for sure. And then simply top up. So this is my little apple of my chai sparkling cocktail, great as a fall spiced aperitif. Nice, fresh, and bright. And then last but not least, I also wanted to talk just a little bit about incorporating cider into some of your classic cocktail recipes. It really can span the spectrum. If you're an Aperol Spritz fan, perhaps instead of using that little splash of soda water, you'll have your Aperol Prosecco and a little splash of dry hard cider, or even a flavored cider if you like it a little sweeter. Or even with a margarita, some people will add just a splash of soda water to kind of brighten and incorporate the ingredients. Again, a splash of cider will definitely fit the bill, and just kind of add a little bit of sweetness perhaps, and also a little bit of fall for sure. In this case, I decided to go full fall in my mind with a little added ginger and make a cider mule. So we'll start with our classic ingredients, about 1.5 ounces of vodka. And again, you can play around with this if you prefer a whiskey mule or otherwise. And because we're substituting, in this case, the effervescence and that ginger beer with our dry cider, I went ahead and made a ginger syrup. And all this takes is basically making a ginger tea. Dice up, a couple thumbs worth of ginger root, nice and fine and peeled. Throw that in with about a cup of water. Bring it up to a simmer. Let it just steep for a little while, and then go ahead and add equal amount sugar. So 1 cup water, 1 cup sugar. Stir that all together, and you've got your ginger syrup, nice and spicy. Adds that little bit of sweetness, but not more liquid, so you're not going to dilute the drink down anymore. Another tidbit on that, you can go ahead and take that now caramelized sort of candied ginger, and I like to either incorporate it into my mulled cider, or sometimes even grind it up with extra sugar to create a nice sugared rim accent for the garnish. But for today, we're going to keep it simple. So of course we have our vodka. We're going to add our ginger syrup and fresh lime juice. So in this case, I do about a quarter to a half ounce of the ginger syrup. Again, if you like it sweeter, go heavier or use a sweeter cider, but I always like to start light so I can add more if desired. I do like it a little limey, so we'll go about 3/4 to an ounce of lime juice. Now in this case, I like to give it just a little stir, kind of incorporate the syrup, melt a little bit of the ice, and then we will go ahead and just top up with our lemon dry cider, maybe just a tiny stir more. And of course, as you can see, I'm using a mason jar. A Moscow Mule copper mug is the most appropriate, but I think this is a fun accent as well. Any kind of double rocks glass will work. Crushed ice advised, but not necessary. And there you have it. A few variations on the use of apple cider and hard sparkling apple cider for your fall cocktails. I hope you enjoy the rest of your holiday season. Thank you so much for joining, and cheers.